And we've been going through a series called, I've called it, for lack of a better title, A Day in the Life of Jesus over Passion Week. So trying to really hone in every single day, 24-hour period. What did Jesus do? What were his activities? What did he face every single day up into the cross? So just to recap, day one was the Sunday, the triumphal entry on the donkey, where he presented himself as Messiah, allowing himself to be worshiped, ending that day by surveying the temple and then calling it a day. And then Monday, the next day, was the temple whipping, so to speak, driving out all the corruption and all of that. And then we really honed in on lessons of a fig tree, which were about the destruction of Israel because of their sin and not producing fruit. Tuesday last week was a really busy, heavy day for Jesus. What we talked about was all the controversies and the confrontations and the debates that he found himself engaged in from all the Jewish leaders and the political leaders trying to trip him up. He followed that up with a bunch of teachings. And then one of the longest sermons Jesus ever gave was at the end of Tuesday, when he told his disciples about the coming again destruction of Jerusalem and the end times and how to prepare and all those things. So a very, 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 very long day for Jesus last week. Okay. And it ended with heavy hearts for the disciples. I mean, we talk about Jesus's day. Imagine how the disciples felt after that long. Oh yeah, by the way, the end's coming and right? Destruction and death and all these things. So they call it a day, and that brings us to Wednesday, day 4. And a lot of scholars call it Spy Wednesday because this is the day of backstabbing and betrayal. Little is known about this specific day. Like there's little activity that's recorded that we know of, but the things that we know of, I'm going to cover today. So Wednesday begins in scripture with the ego-wounded hearts of the Jewish leaders who had just gotten schooled by Jesus over and over again after being publicly shamed for their behavior by Jesus. They're hot under the collar. Okay. So fire is hot. So that brings us to the morning of Wednesday. So Matthew 26, 3-4 tells us, then the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. So they've gone from simply wanting to arrest Jesus to get him out of the picture to conspiring his death. And when it says they assembled and they plotted, they were doing so very inconspicuously. They didn't want anyone to know. They didn't want the masses of the crowds to know they were doing this. Because remember, at this time, the streets of Jerusalem were flooded with 1 million to 2 million people. So they had to hide to have these conversations, which is why they convened at the palace of Caiaphas. Because not only was he a Sadducee, which remember, Sadducees were overseeing the temple. They were in control of the temple. They also had close political ties with the Romans. So they were going after the person that could help them get the furthest, right? They were desperate, and that's the best person that they could go to. Someone who was on their side and had all these connections with the Roman government. Okay, so as a result of all this inside chatter that the Romans are noticing from this Sadducee that they go hang out with, the Romans were on guard for the slightest hint of a revolt. Okay, so they doubled up their forces on the streets. But they were expecting this revolt to come from Jesus and his followers. Okay, and now the trickery that these Jewish leaders are trying to trick is not Jesus anymore. Now it's the people. They're like, we can't trip Jesus up. We've got to deceive the crowds. We've got to make them believe something different than what they believe. Okay. They had to get the masses on their side. But I want to point out an interesting thing here. These so-called spiritual leaders of men of God, right? They didn't fear God at all when plotting the murder of an innocent man. Who did they fear the most? The people. Who were they serving the most? The people. So it just made me think, a question that I put on your outline: how often do we put our fear of others above the opinion and the truth or fear of God? Do people and what they think drive us, or does what God say drive us? Do we ask, I wonder how so-and-so will react, and be more concerned about so-and-so's reaction and response than we are about God's reaction, whether we do or do not do a specific act? Are we more afraid to offend the people around us than we are our Creator? Just something to think about. So the intent and insistence of these leaders on not making a scene during Passover tells us that never once considered or consulted God on this matter. They were operating completely on their own. And at this very moment of scheming and hiding, Jesus is finally relaxing after that emotionally charged day the day before. So Mark 4:3 tells us, and being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he, Jesus, sat at the table, a woman came having an alabaster flask and very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it over his head. So let's stop here and set the scene. You have the Jewish leaders are over here hiding, doing all this conspiracy stuff. At the same time, Jesus is hanging out at a Simon the leper. Okay. Now we have to really understand he's an ex-leper, or he would not be in coercion with other people, right? And the only reason he could be at Simon the leper's house was because Jesus had healed him. Okay, so there's an encounter right there that's beautiful enough. Your healer just is having dinner with you. Okay, so along with Simon and Jesus, also when in attendance at this dinner were his 12 disciples, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, who Jesus had raised from the dead. I mean, wouldn't that have been an awesome opportunity to be a fly on the wall, watching and listening to their dinner conversation, right? Each of them in that room having these personal stories of miraculous encounters with Jesus. And there is no way you can't tell me they didn't discuss Jesus, right? Which is why we gather together and talk about what Jesus is doing in each of our lives individually, because it builds on who Jesus is, right? It's important to do that. So this is total speculation, and this is total side note, but I could imagine Simon going off on his healing encounter. Jesus is here because you know what he did for me? You should have seen the sores on my hands and my body. They were restored to healthy skin. He's going off on how his limbs grew back and he regained strength, and he was able to enter back into social settings again, and how a death sentence became an extended life opportunity, right? I'm sorry. I just have to see Lazarus going. Oh, yeah? Yeah. I can one up you. You may have been saved from dying. I was dead. Right? For 4 days, mind you. All right, it's total speculation, but guys, come on. When you on a, right? All right. All of us want to do that. Side note, pregnant women are the same. They want to tell their story, right? Their delivery stories, right? We're always one-upping. Cannot tell me that did not happen in that room. Anyway. So in the midst of this scenario, a woman who from John's gospel we know is Mary breaks open this bottle of scented oil and dumps it on the head of Jesus. This was considered an abundantly extravagant display of devotion to Jesus. Let me explain why. Because this particular perfume, spikenard, was extremely rare and at this time could only be imported from India. Okay, so it was very, very expensive and highly valuable and hard to get your hands on. It was possibly, scholars say, even a family heirloom. So imagine how much more impassioned she was to offer this to Jesus. And it had been passed on from a generation to generation to her. And it was also common for such an oil or perfume to be used as an investment. Okay, so there's a lot that could have been gained from this little flask of oil. So when it's At this time, it was customary when a guest arrived at a dinner party such as this, the host would anoint the guest's head with a dab of oil. Okay, so that's normal. But that wasn't good enough for Mary. It seems that without a word being spoken, she went much further than expected and poured out that entirety of that bottle on Jesus's head. Okay. Insight number 1 on your outline, something to just think about. Our hearts should reflect Mary's desire to please only Jesus rather than the hearts of those who sought to please people, right? To accomplish that, sometimes peace with others must be sacrificed in order to have the fullest peace with God. So here she is displaying the complete opposite of what those betrayers are doing on the other side, right? Mary was desperate to show Jesus the depth of her love at this moment, but not for what he had done, but for who he was and who he professed himself to be, okay? But think about what a special moment this was for Jesus. Knowing others, he knows they're devising a plan, a death plan at this exact same time. He also knows at this moment that in approximately 36 hours, he's going to be suffering on the cross and dying at the hands of many who 3 days before were praising him, right? And also knowing that one other person in this room would assist via the ultimate betrayal to come. But in the midst of all of this, there's this one person, Mary, who seems to understand who he really is. And she truly makes the ultimate sacrifice. Just think about what a welcomed moment that must have been for Jesus. Think about those moments when you are in a devastating place, that one person who just looks at you and sees you and knows you. That's what's happening between Mary and Jesus. Insight number 2, intimacy with Jesus can be accomplished in any setting when we are solely focused on him. Mary seems to understand that pretty well, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. But sadly, this beautiful moment that Jesus, I'm sure, is just relishing in and looking her in the eye, and she's looking him in the eye, and sadly, that moment is interrupted. With verse 4, we learn, but there were some who were indignant among themselves and said, why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they criticized her sharply. Okay, so much for a peaceful moment void of conflict, right? That instant is now gone. Mark doesn't say who the some are, but John, in his version of this, in chapter 12, names Judas as the instigator, the one speaking out against it, okay? He's the instigator of indignation regarding the expense that is lost here. And although, though, we have to understand Judas may have started that attack, Mark confirms that they, the other disciples, joined in, piggybacked on it, and criticized her sharply. They specifically we know that Judas is doing the talking, accusing her of wasting money. But you have to understand, by Greek definition, the fact that they were criticizing her sharply meant they were in a outrageous display of rage at this moment. This isn't like, what are you doing? This was full-blown anger being shown at Mary at this moment, okay, rebuking her actions. So Judas is instigating this. He's probably the one with the most anger. The other disciples are probably, oh yeah, what are you doing? What are you doing, right? So I want to deep dive here in a moment, for just a moment, on Judas here for a bit. He's such a large role in this whole factor, right? We know Judas was self-serving in his disgust against Mary and her actions, because John 12:6 tells us that Judas said this. He said, He said what he said against Mary, not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. So John reveals more in this scenario about the heart of Judas. Okay. So in his eyes, Mary wasn't cheating the poor. She was cheating him, right? She was depriving Judas of the opportunity to get a hold of that, to sell it and take some of the proceeds off the top without anybody else noticing. If he had gotten his hands on that oil and sold it, he would have gotten probably about $10,000 at that time, which was an entire year's wage for a working man's salary at that time. So he was devastated by this loss. Why? Because he was motivated by money, right? Which makes me think insight number 3, the more that money motivates a heart, the greater the impact when it is lost or even taken out of reach. I remember one day, this is a side note, I was driven by money, and I was a saver and I was a penny pincher. I had a $50 bill and we were at Disney, and I went to go get that $50 bill out of my pocket and it was gone. At some point, I was taking my card for getting in and out of Disney, in and out, and the $50 bill probably fell on the floor. I was angry, frustrated, sad for 2 days. Dave's like, It was not the happiest place on earth, but why? I was motivated by the money, and that loss, even though it did not hinder our ability to eat or go to Disney, it was so frustrating. That's how motivated I was by making sure every cent mattered, okay? Just an example. So Judas knew the price of this rare and precious oil, which is why it angered him so deeply. But I love what Charles Spurgeon says about this. He said, "I should never have known what it cost, nor would you either, if Judas had not marked it down in his pocketbook and mentioned it." That's how driven he was. He I could have gotten this much money for that. Okay. So furthermore, we need to understand that the word for thief that John uses to describe Judas literally means stolen by careful design. Okay, so meaning it was a thought that became a plan that then became an action to execute, so not to be noticed by anyone. We have to relate that to sin in our life, right? Insight number 4, just like Judas, sin is often a process that needs to be addressed as a thought, so it doesn't become a plan in action or a deliberate choice. We don't have to wait until the sin happens. We can address it so much sooner. It's also interesting that scholars refer to Judas as a fault finder here, because he was quick to criticize from a very disgusting place of hypocrisy, right? Which is a good reason that Jesus taught. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eyes, but do not consider the plank in your own eye, right? As humans, often, what is it we say? If you spot it, you got it, right? That's Judas here, right? Insight number 5, another lesson we can learn from Judas. If you find yourself criticizing someone over anything, just whatever it is, maybe look at yourself in that particular area first. Scholars say that Judas was indignant for yet another reason other than the obvious waste of money and greed and critical spirit that we just talked about. As a disciple, he was quick to criticize someone who showed more love to Jesus in that moment than he himself had ever shown, right? Criticizing this expression of admiration for him was way easier than admitting that he couldn't do the same. And how often do we judge people that are having these outward expressions toward Jesus as being freaky, Jesus freaky, or whatever, right? Why is it uncomfortable for us? We have to ask ourselves sometimes, why is it uncomfortable? Is it because we can't do it, haven't chosen to do it? Just an interesting thought that scholars brought up. And then maybe deep down, Judas also knew that his life was a waste, right? He called out the waste because it's a waste within himself as well. Because after all, the word waste in verse 4, according to Greek, means destruction and loss, okay? And it is the same word, the exact same word used here that John uses in chapter 17:12 when Jesus referred to the life of Judas. Jesus referred to the life of Judas as that same waste, a destruction of lost and waste. So you spot it, you got it? Right? So Judas criticized Mary for wasting money, but he wasted his entire life. And to top that off, I don't think we understand the moment that Jesus had where he has this beautiful woman in front of him giving up all of this expensive perfume and adoring him, only to be interrupted by somebody else who is wasting their life, right? But imagine how Jesus must have felt at that indignation that his own disciples expressed, because they couldn't see the value of Jesus deserving what she was giving him, right? So Judas even considered the life of Jesus unworthy and wasteful enough. He didn't deserve that. So much more to it than I think we ever talk about. But insight number 6, no sacrifice on our behalf is too great when compared to the value that Jesus provides. But don't discount the joy you bring to the heart of Jesus with each offering of love and expression of devotion that we give. It makes him smile when we worship him, when we love him, when we tell him we adore him, when we give up something for him. It creates those merry moments for us. Regardless, these men Mary had shared meals with, worshiped Jesus with, she ministered alongside with, are in her face, spoiling this beautiful moment. She's probably starting to wonder, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong, right? But Jesus comes to her defense, right? Verse 6, but Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? When he says, why do you trouble her? In Greek, it literally means, why are you cutting her sharply to the heart? That's how offensive their actions were and critical of her. And that's why Jesus is saying, no. And then he goes on to say, she has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good. But me, you do not always have. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. So first of all, Jesus is not promoting poverty or apathy over the poor, right? He is quoting Deuteronomy 15:11 here, that literally says there will always be some in the land who are poor. He's reminding them, you're always going to have poor here, which is why it was commanded at the time, share freely with the poor and the other Israelites in need. He's quoting, yes, you're always going to have these people around you. In other words, there's always going to be activity or opportunity for generous activity. But right now, in this moment, she is choosing intimacy with her Savior, her Lord. And once again, we find Mary with the proper posture before Jesus. First, remember, rather than being like a busy bee like her sister, where was she? At the feet of Jesus. At the death of Lazarus, the second time that we really notice her posture, She's questioning, but remember, she was fully surrendered, but yet not my will. She might as well have said, I trust you, God, right? And now here she is giving an abundance out of her resources. Dare I say, next to Jesus, Mary appears to be one of the most consistent in character and devotion throughout Scripture. But understand that Jesus is also defending her when he says she has done what she could. And I think that is a testament that we need to understand that that is all that Jesus expects of us. All that we can give and nothing more. He honored that. He honored saying, you've done all that you could, right? One scholar said this about that. Jesus gave her the highest compliment when he said, she has done what she could. God expects no more from us than what we can do, but be aware of setting your sights so low that you believe that doing nothing is doing what you can. All cannot do great things for Christ, but it is well if each one does what he can as unto the Lord himself. And that just made me think, insight number 7, imagine what more can be accomplished for God's kingdom if each person does what they can in service and sacrifice to contribute, right? I've been part of church since I was 12 years old, heavily involved since I was 16. And I'm sadly, it's hard to say, but more people make excuses as to why they can't give or can't get involved rather than take time to evaluate what they are actually able to do, right? But Jesus further commends Mary by basically saying, she is preparing me for burial, which you disciples of mine, he's basically saying, you guys haven't figured it out yet. You haven't accepted this is going to happen. She gets it, right? Mary understood that Jesus was about to die, and instead of covering him in oil after his death, as would be customary, she presented it to him in life. She is giving Jesus the roses, the flowers, before the service, before the memorial, when it really mattered, right? And this isn't on your outline or paper, but how often should we do the now rather than wait until the after, right? That's a deep thought in and of itself. The disciples were not catching on because remember, when Peter heard of Jesus mentioning his death, he tried to talk him out of it, right? Instead of denying it, Mary turned the truth of what was to come into an opportunity for a deep display of love. And scholars say that this act of devotion was planned on Mary's part. This wasn't something that spontaneously happened as an emotional response. It was deliberate, as, remember, this was Simon the leper's home. It would not have been her place to anoint him with the oil. And it's something that she would have had intentionally brought with her from her home to this dinner party, right? She intentionally thought out a unique way to express her love and devotion to Jesus. Charles Spurgeon says this about that. But part of Mary's great love was displayed in the fact that she came up with the idea to express her love for Jesus in this way. If there was a command to do this, it would never be this precious. The better part of the whole matter will lie in the sacred ingenuity of your spirit in inventing something for him out of your own fervent soul. That's challenging, right? We often think the rituals, the things that we're used to, we are taught this is what we do to worship Jesus, right? But a question on your outline, how often do we plan opportunities to personally and uniquely express our devotion to Jesus based on what he has personally done for us? My challenge, encouragement to you is take time this week to assess what you can do. What can you give? How can you uniquely, out of your own personality, your own offerings express something unique and personal as an expression of love to Jesus? I want to hear stories next week about that. Mary did so in such a way that Jesus responded this in verse 9. Assuredly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. That's an outstanding, right? Exactly. Here we are 2,000 years plus later, talking about her devotion and learning from her devotion. But in this statement, you also have to notice the confidence that Jesus displays in the fact that he knows his gospel is going to be spreading throughout the whole world, right? Which is how he faced the cross. The hope that was set before him allowed him to endure the cross. That hope is this good news being spread all over. So along with her memorial, he knew the news of his sacrifice and resurrection would be preached to the whole world. So in the midst of all of this, Judas reprimands, Jesus rebukes, comes back at it, right? Imagine how Mr. Judas feels about this celebration over Mary. I mean, just think about it, right? He's already greedy. First, she wastes the money, and now Jesus is elevating that sacrifice. He's elevating her willingness, and he's elevating her status, saying she's going to be memorialized. Judas has had enough, okay? Verse 10, then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were so glad. They finally had their winning ticket, right? And they promised to give him money. So he sought how he might conveniently betray him. Now, according to Luke's version, 22 verse 3, this is the precise moment when Satan entered Judas. I think that's an interesting thing that we need to understand. Satan wasn't guiding him all the way. Satan may have prompted and perhaps guided here and there, but up until this point, at this point, Judas now gives himself completely to the enemy, right? This does not diminish Judas's personal responsibility because none of this was done against the will of Judas, right? It was done with his will. So a willing Satan used a willing Judas. God didn't prompt Judas, Satan did. And I think that's really important to really understand, okay? God didn't make Judas do this for his will, right? So this is what we understand to be the end of Wednesday for Jesus. He watches one of his closest companions at this moment exit this home, probably fuming, stomping out in order to commit the ultimate act of betrayal. So I want to end for just a moment. What were the motives behind such a disdain for Jesus that Judas, who he had followed for over 3 years, this man who had done no wrong, what leads to such a place of an abandonment, right? Because sin and disloyalty rarely are spontaneous, like I mentioned before, I think we would do well to learn some of the motives and beliefs behind the acts of Judas so not to follow in the same path, okay? So let me close with a few lessons learned from a disciple turned double-crosser. Number 1, jealousy breeds contentment. Let me explain. See, most people don't realize that Judas was the only Judean among the disciples. All the others were Galileans. Okay? He's the oddball out. Scholars speculate that Judas resented the leadership of some of these uneducated fishermen that were telling him what to do. Because historically, Judeans looked down on the Galileans. They looked down on them spiritually, socially, economically, and politically. So Judas probably, with this history, came into the picture with a higher than thou personality and belief. Okay? It's not a far stretch to say that he envied the equal success of these other disciples and craved to be better than them as he had been taught that they were. Okay? He was, after all, placed as the treasurer, right? You must see my value. Matthew was a tax collector. He wasn't put in that position. So somebody who comes in with this higher than thou personality and thought is like, oh, see, I'm better. I got the job, you didn't, right? But it was in that very role, handling the influx and the outflow of the money, holding the currency, that it is said to have fed that desire he had for more, right? When you don't hold it, you don't have it, you don't just freely throw it around. Who thinks of the idea of getting more? But once you get that taste, right, it started to feed him. Okay. Which leads me to number 2, greed breeds deception. And this is about him and the money in his life, but we can translate these to any portion of our life. We are greedy in different ways, right? But Judas was so deceptive in his misappropriation of funds that it is said the other disciples did not suspect Judas at all, right? All the way up to the end, they did not know what Judas was doing. That's deception. That's why when Jesus says, one here will betray me later, we'll talk about next week, when he says that at the Last Supper, every single other disciples ask, is it I? Is it me? Will it be me? Not one of them says, is it he? Right? They didn't know. Even when Jesus said to Judas, after it's revealed that he's going to be the one that does it, and he takes the bread and gives him the bite of morsel, Jesus looks at him and says, do what you must do quickly. The other disciples didn't get it because they're thinking Judas is going out to go buy further items needed for the rest of the festival and the feast. Otherwise, at a minimum, Peter, remember, who's like, I'm not going to let you die, Jesus. If he knew something was up, don't you think he would have stopped him? But they didn't. They didn't see it. Later, Peter cut off a Roman soldier about to lay hands on Jesus. Don't you think he would have cut the throat of Judas had he known the depth of deception? That's how devious greed can get us to be, right? That's the depth and level of perception Judas achieved. A rising jealousy, a growing greed for more money, but that wasn't all. Judas wanted power and authority. So number 3, selfish ambition breeds ruthlessness. So scholars believe that Judas had personal ambition for following Jesus. So it's believed that Judas was among many other Jews who thought Jesus was the political Messiah. Remember, we talked that they thought that he was coming to overthrow Rome and release them from this oppression, right? This was going to be a political uprising. With that belief, following Jesus as a disciple gave him hopes of being a high-ranking member of that coming government, right? That Jesus would soon reign over. So when Judas witnessed Jesus riding in on the donkey as a king, allowing himself to be finally worshipped, Judas is like, oh, it's coming. This is happening. Just like a lot of the other Jews who were sounding Hosanna. Remember? They're also, Hosanna was not saying, we just praise you, Jesus. We believe you're coming to save us as the king from our oppressors, right? Judas is amongst those believing that. It would have been exhilarating for him at that moment, for Judas to go, it's happening. This is the political revelation that we've been waiting for all this time, which is another reason none of them probably figured out he's going to die, right? Judas thinks he's set for life, but then he follows this parade of Jesus to the temple, the end of day 1, right? And all Jesus does is looks around. And then they go home or to Mary and Martha and Lazarus. It's like, okay, oh, darn, maybe tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow we're going to get this. And then the next day, Jesus drives out the fraudulent criminals out of the temple. And Judas is like, wait, what? You just cost a lot of money, right? And there's no plan of action against Rome. But now there's a speech about the destruction from this fig tree and his death. Judas is thinking, this is not what I had in mind. If you die, this is deception at its best, is what Judas is thinking as a deceiver, right? Right? To top it all off, he just commended a lowly woman for her wasteful actions and reiterates again his burial soon to come. This, scholars say, was a defining final straw that broke the camel back moment for Judas. He's like, yeah, this is not political. This is spiritual. Didn't catch on till now, and he didn't like the sound of it. And there's one scholar that even goes as far to suggest that Judas may as well have said, you betrayed me for not being the king I wanted you to be. So I'm going to betray you. I could put an insight there. I mean, how often do we anticipate and think that this is what Jesus should be doing? And so we hold back. We don't fully surrender because we don't like the way he's doing something. I'm just going to say it. We all have a Judas within us. We all have the ability. There's a seed there somewhere, right? In fact, Judas is so ruthless in his ambition, which is why he goes to the Jewish leaders and now he switches sides, okay? And he's so ruthless that he negotiated with these religious leaders. We know from other accounts of this story. What will you give me if I deliver him to you? It's like, what am I going to get out of this? Because now I know you want something. Now I'm going to play you. He could have easily, and this is what people don't understand, he could have easily gotten more money for this act as an informant, handing Jesus over to these Jewish leaders because he was their ticket, right? And remember, these Jewish leaders are wealthy, living in luxury. Judas could have easily negotiated more from these leaders in such a desperate state. But instead, he settles for 30 pieces of silver. And at that time, that's not a lot of money. In fact, 30 pieces of silver is the exact price paid to master for a slave. 30 pieces of silver got you the lowliest of the lows. Jesus was not worth more than a slave in the eyes of Judas. And at that moment, money didn't matter. Putting Jesus in his place did. The Jewish leaders needed an ally, and it came with this ruthless actions of this man with selfish ambition, driven from a thought to a plan to an action over and over and over again. But above all else, I can't end without saying this. We have to go back with Mary. Why did Mary love Jesus? Because Jesus loved so deeply and so well. Number 4, Jesus still loves despite it all. Despite what Jesus knew Judas would do, he invited him to be a disciple. Despite the ending prediction, Jesus invited Judas to walk with him, preach with him, heal the lame and the sick all alongside of him. Despite the missing money, Jesus continued to invest in the life of Judas. And fast forward a day to the Last Supper. It is widely believed by scholars that sitting at the right hand of Jesus was Peter, but Judas was on his left. That was a place of honor that was only given by the host by personal invitation. Jesus invited Judas to sit next to him. Now we know there are things that had to be fulfilled. But despite all these things that a person does, Jesus is still love and shows us that people are worth the risk. He still made that investment. Could Judas have changed his mind somewhere along the line? Yeah, he could have. And guess what? God would have found another way to fulfill his plan, right? Now, obviously, Judas was part of that fulfillment of prophecy, but more than that, some scholars have posed these questions. Was Jesus giving Judas a chance to change his mind? Was he showing him such an immense amount of love that in hopes he would receive it? Was Jesus teaching us that his love knows no bounds? Was Jesus teaching us that anybody and everybody is worth the risk of that chance of change? After all, isn't that why he died? Out of love for each person, that none should perish? Probably all of the above, because that's who Jesus is. But as we close this day with a betrayal, no one can argue that Jesus still loved Judas the same as he does you and I. And even though Judas never experienced a heart change, we can learn to be under constant evaluation so not to betray Jesus with even an ounce of our being, our whole heart, our whole soul, our whole mind, our whole strength, right? But I want to close with the idea that this is the Jesus that Mary found worthy of such an extravagant and abundant expression of love. That is the Jesus that we serve, one who still loved Judas enough to keep him close, to love on him and participate. But I want us to focus on that love that Mary displayed, and that Jesus is worth every ounce of that devotion and love